You may know that as part of my guerrilla marketing, in the mornings, I haven't done it yet this morning, but I will get into YouTube and I will look for the videos on Edgar Allan Poe and Charles Dickens, and particularly those on A Christmas Carol and the Raven, and I will post a link to my papers about those respective works. And occasionally I'll get a comment. Now, I've written about this in my written blog, but I'm going to read it aloud, the comment that was left on one of these, and use it as the launching point for this discussion today. So this concerns A Christmas Carol, where I assert that Charles Dickens didn't write it. And this is the comment that was left underneath. He says, "I would like you to present evidence that what you say is true." Well, that's the whole point of linking to the article, the 49-page paper, which apparently he hasn't read. He says, "I have very good reason to believe that A Christmas Carol was an original concept and written by Charles Dickens as an original story, first published in 1843. Since reading a similar claim, I have researched this issue and can find no credible documentary evidence that records Charles Dickens copied, stole, recreated, or was inspired by anything other than his passionate outrage for the plight of child slave labor that was published in a British parliamentary report of 1842-43. He says, Dickens' publisher recorded that Mr. Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol in just a few weeks after giving a speech in Manchester that referred to the horrible conditions children were forced to work in during that period, quote, the Hungry Forties. This information is backed up by documents in the British Museum/Library. Now, if he's talking about a similar claim, he probably means Professor Natalie McKnight of Boston and her theory that Dickens visited the mills in Lowell, Massachusetts in his 1842 visit to the United States and was given a copy of their paper that was written by the mill workers, the girls, called The Offering. And she finds some of the pieces in there to be kind of somewhat similar to A Christmas Carol, and she extrapolates that Dickens may have been influenced by those pieces. And I think it's kind of a feminist perspective, you know, that women were involved and so on. Little do they know, but it's kind of weak, in my opinion. And so if he has looked at that and found it weak, he's now extrapolating that all the other theories that are similar are similarly weak, but he hasn't read my paper yet. Now, as far as Dickens' publisher, I think he's referring to John Forster, Dickens' publisher and biographer, and that man was a liar. The story that Dickens gave about how he wrote A Christmas Carol walking the black streets of London, that was a lie. Forster repeated it and embellished it a little bit, from many nights to many and many a night or something like that. That was just a lie. So they're just not credible, either one of them. And then as far as reading this report and giving a speech and about the horrible conditions and so on, I believe that Dickens did that. I don't believe he was sincere. He was an actor. I think his career was kind of flagging, and I think he had figured out that the way to popularity was to promote himself as a social reformer. Now, this shouldn't surprise us because corporations do this all the time, in terms of having a PR division and a philanthropic arm and so on. This should not be news to anybody that it can be done hypocritically. Now, why do I think that Dickens was a hypocrite? Because I can prove it. In a few entries back, I read a portion of what historians call the violated letter. And if you look up the violated letter and you read it in its entirety, or as much as you can find, with the understanding that Dickens did in fact have this long-time affair with Ellen Ternan, and then you add on to that the new information that's come up about Dickens and his personal character, you will find that he was demonstrably a flaming hypocrite, which means that he could very easily have done what the corporations do and have like a PR program, to put himself forth as a social reformer, and that's what I believe he was doing. Now, I want to say, before I go with the rest of this, that, defending one's hero is a laudable thing to do. And the reason that he's defending Dickens is because he believes Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, and he was touched by A Christmas Carol. So the logic is circular. Until you can get Dickens away from A Christmas Carol, people will defend him because they emotionally associate him with A Christmas Carol, see? So it's, like I said, it's kind of circular logic. And people will go into irrational states to defend their hero if emotionally they feel that he was the author of A Christmas Carol. So he continues. Now he starts attacking me, or attacking me by way of defending his hero. It is unfair that you make these claims, which are a slur upon the good name and reputation of Mr. Charles Dickens and that of his surviving relatives and his estate. Well, I don't know anything about his surviving relatives. I've seen a few of them online. But Dickens' reputation is in big trouble, and increasingly in big trouble. And this is the problem. You have a person evidently of low character who supposedly wrote a moral classic, and it's just impossible. I call it a donkey's head on a lion's body. It's manifestly impossible. And this is getting more and more obvious as more dirt comes out on Charles Dickens, that he couldn't possibly, or if he did, it means that there's no such thing as morality. It's all sham, see, which is really dangerous. So then he says, a blog on the internet does not constitute legal proof of creative ownership. Well, I don't know what we're talking about legal. What does legal have to do with anything? And a blog on the internet, that's kind of a slur in itself, is a mere, in other words, he's implying a mere blog on the internet does not constitute legal proof of creative ownership. So then he says, I respectfully bring your attention to, and it's a video that's on the British Library's website, and an expert, I think it's Michael Slater, if I remember correctly, talks about Dickens and his philanthropic interests and so on. And I talked about that in my written blog. I won't go back to that. One thing, I don't remember the particulars. But then he finishes up with what I want to start with today. Your claim is as ridiculous, now he's slurring me, your claim is as ridiculous and unfounded as saying that the works of William Shakespeare were really written by a bored former clerk in the struggling community of Roanoke. Well, I don't know what that means exactly, except obviously it's impossible from the historical perspective, but because there was no Roanoke in Shakespeare's day. But in terms of it being a bored former clerk, I don't know what that's supposed to mean. But what it means is, if it means anything, it means that I'm just grabbing some hack writer out of the air and claiming that he wrote the piece that Charles Dickens is credited with. It's been called the greatest little book in the world by some people, And who is this Matthew Franklin Whittier that I would claim this work for him? Who is he? Well, if he'd read my work, he would know who he is. But that's what we're going to talk about today, because Matthew Franklin Whittier was a child prodigy and a literary genius, and I'm going to show you some of his earliest work and how sophisticated it was. Not all of it. I have two ways to go with this. I can either give a whole bunch of examples, reading like the first couple paragraphs of a whole bunch of examples, which kind of shows that it's not a fluke, or I can delve into one and really let you see Matthew's mind at work, which I think is really the better way to go, because I need to let Matthew speak fully for himself instead of pulling out sound bites in a case like this, because I'm trying to demonstrate that he's a child prodigy and a literary genius, and you have to see how his thoughts develop all the way through in order to establish that. So this is the earliest example of Matthew's work, earliest antiquarian example that I have. I've shown you this before. It's the New England Galaxy, the December 16, 1825 edition. And it's not in very good shape. It's very fragile. I have to be careful with it, but I'm going to read from it. Gives a certain amount of authenticity, and it's also kind of fun to read from these original sources. This is not when he began. He began in the spring of this year, like in March, as near as I can tell. And he used different pseudonyms. He didn't sign with his own name. So it's a certain amount of extrapolation and interpretation involved in identifying this as Matthew's work. But I'm not completely limited to style analysis. There is some objective evidence for this. And I've gone through this before. I'm going to go back through it again very briefly. This is a 1970 reprint of the memoirs of Joseph T. Buckingham, published in 1852. And he was Matthew's editor on this paper, the New England Galaxy. I think he was also Matthew's employer, because for a while, Matthew ran away from home, apparently, after he published a few of these pieces in the New England Galaxy. And he went to Boston, and then he went to New York, back and forth. And I think that he worked as a printer's apprentice for Joseph T. Buckingham's other paper, the Daily, called The Courier. I can't prove that, but there's some references to it. But this is what he says in his memoirs. This is page 252 on this. He's talking about the young men that wrote for him. He says, while the Galaxy was thus conducted, the labors of the editors were lightened by the contributions of Moses Whitney, Jr., a young gentleman engaged in mercantile pursuits. His pieces are signed, quote, Trismegistus. He had written many brief paragraphs for the paper in years preceding, under various signatures, generally on light and transient topics, which had no other importance or claim to notice than that they afforded opportunities for the exhibition of the wit and humor for which their author was celebrated. We'll go back to that in a minute. There's a lot of clues in there. Neither of these young men, except Mr. Holbrook, he mentioned several, had enjoyed the benefit of what is called a, quote, liberal education, but they possessed talent, industry, and perseverance, which gave to their friends delightful promise of eminent usefulness and reputation. A collection of all their writings, though it would contain much that is crude and unfinished, would yet be honorable to their memories. Yes, their memories, for they are all gone. Buckingham, Holbrook, Whitney, Locke, such was the order of their going. And then he goes on about that. Buckingham was his own son, Edwin Buckingham, who I think was a little bit older than Matthew. What I feel was that young Edwin Buckingham was a thorn in Matthew's side, because Matthew had kind of been taken under Joseph's wing, he mentored him, and Edwin was jealous. Matthew was younger, but he was actually more talented than Edwin. And Edwin was kind of spoiled, I think. So the one thing that doesn't fit here is he's describing Moses Whitney's work and says that it was, he says it was generally on light and transient topics which had no other importance or claim to notice than that they afforded opportunities, etc. Well, if you look at the 4 Trismegistus signed pieces in the New England Galaxy, at least the 4 I found, that's not true. They were like serious essays and very insightful essays. So what he's saying is not correct. But I think that his son died fairly young, like in 1832, something like that, after they had established the New England Magazine in New York. And I think he was trying to kind of build up his son Edwin's memory, kind of at the expense of Matthew's to some extent. But there's a lot of clues in here. First off, Moses Whitney, that's Matthew's name with the first initial and the first 4 letters of the last name preserved. Matthew apparently charged all of his editors and former editors to keep his name out of it, to keep him secret. And in this case, I think that Joseph Buckingham wanted to brag on Trismegistus having first appeared in his newspaper around 1828, because Trismegistus was getting very popular in the Carpetbag. Matthew had brought that back. It was not Benjamin Drew, as the editor of that paper, B.P. Shillaber, said. It was Matthew that was writing as Trismegistus and all the spin-offs. And I think that Joseph Buckingham wanted to put in his 2 cents and say, no, he wrote initially for me. But then he says that Moses Whitney died, see? So actually, to take him literally, it would have to be a different Trismegistus, which now wipes out his rationale, of jealousy for wanting to say it in the first place. So he's twisting the truth to hide Matthew's identity. And Matthew only signed 4 as Trismegistus. His main go-to signature in that paper was NNK, which I think probably stood for Never Never Know, deeply anonymous, in other words, and some other ones. And you notice that he says, even though he says his pieces are signed Trismegistus, he then says that he wrote under various signatures. So he contradicts himself. He says that his pieces were signed Trismegistus, but then he says he wrote under various signatures. Well, that was not very common in that day, but it was definitely Matthew's modus operandi all his life, to remain deeply undercover and to write under various pseudonyms. Matthew wrote under possibly even hundreds of different pseudonyms throughout his life. So that identifies him there, along with the Moses Whitney, which is so similar to Matthew Whittier. And then he says that he also was involved in, or that he was involved in mercantile pursuits. Well, that was Matthew also, because Matthew had a dual career, a journalistic career and a mercantile career. So that also identifies him. So when you can triangulate like that, we've now got 3 indicators of Matthew in, this one brief description. And then there's a 4th one. He says, for the exhibition of the wit and humor for which their author was celebrated. Now, he wasn't. Well, he was celebrated then, because he wrote a very, very early series of letters from Joe Strickland in heavy Yankee dialect. So he was, and that was famous, but they didn't know who was writing it. So he was already celebrated for humor, and he was a humorist. So that's a 4th indicator in this little tiny description here. And there's a 5th one, and that was that he didn't have a liberal education. Well, he got his education. He was self-educated, but he also got it from his future wife, Abby, who was upper class and had had a tutored education. See, so that's 5 indicators pointing to Matthew Franklin Whittier. So the point is, we have objective indications of Matthew's authorship in the New England Galaxy, and I'm not just going by style. So now we're going to look at 2 pieces, and this one is in the December 16, 1825 edition, which I have showed you. I'm going to read from the original, which means I need to get my light down here where I can see. I may stumble a little bit because it's hard to read this copy. And there's one place here where the fold has obliterated the type, and I'm going to insert a copy from a library copy of this so that you can read along with me. It's under miscellanies. I'll show here that is Boston. There's Joseph T. Buckingham's name as the editor. And it begins, for the New England Galaxy, and this is his letter, his introductory letter to the editor, whom of course he knows very well, but he's signing as a subscriber. He says, Mr. Buckingham, sir, the following is an attempt not to persuade anyone, but perhaps to induce a reader of your Galaxy, now and then, by recurring to facts, to make out his own persuasion. If you should think that the zeal and good intent compensate for the various defects of style and expression, you will oblige me by inserting this essay. If, however, you should condemn it, my feelings will be but slightly injured, and no great wrong will be done to the rising generation. Yours with respect, a subscriber. So right now, we know that, I'm going to put this up a little bit on the screen, we know that this is a young person writing. So that eliminates all the adults who could have possibly written this and narrows it down, presumably to that young group of writers that Joseph T. Buckingham mentions in his memoirs. Now, Matthew was a Stoic. From a young age, he'd studied Stoic philosophy, but by nature, he kind of sat hard on his emotions and didn't show them. As a matter of fact, that's where a lot of his humor came from. So the personality expressed here, that it won't bother my feelings, well, that's bravado, and that points to Matthew Franklin Whittier in particular, as well as the indication that it's a young person. Now, the other objective evidence that we have is that Matthew really liked Lord Byron. I haven't made a tally of the number of times that Matthew quoted Byron because some of them are not identified, and I would have to go through all of the works where there's poetry quoted and look them all up and, make a tally of Byron. But I'm guessing, because I've looked them up, as I've done these entries and as I've done my written entries, but I haven't written it all down on a list. I think 20 would be a fair figure. I think he's quoted Byron probably 20 times in the course of his career. So that's another indication. One more interesting indication is that his older brother, John Greenleaf Whittier, was very judgmental against Byron. So they would have argued about this. The question would have come up. So a lot of times when Matthew wrote an editorial or a letter to the editor, it was not actually any disagreement he had with the editor or even the public. It was a private disagreement. It might have been between himself and his brother. It might have been between himself and Abby. See, there's several examples of that where it looks like you can tell pretty much who he had the debate with. And then he became motivated to write this public piece on it. So he probably had a disagreement with John Greenleaf Whittier on this subject. There's at least one piece that John Greenleaf Whittier wrote against Byron, being very judgmental, religiously judgmental. So now we begin. On the high-cried blasphemy of Lord Byron's writings, that's our title. I'm going to read this whole thing. It's rather lengthy. It's very easy to just take that little cursor and move it over and find the ending if you don't want to listen to all of this. But again, the reason I want to read it all is I want to give Matthew a fair chance to show at age 13 just what he's made of, because he is not, as our cynic opined, a bored former clerk in the struggling community of Roanoke. This is a child prodigy who was publishing many years before Charles Dickens ever published anything at all. And when Dickens started publishing, it was light and frothy social satire, and they're about the same age. So Matthew, as a boy of 12, is publishing this, while Dickens is whatever he's doing. He's not writing, whatever he's doing. Loud and frequent have been the assaults upon the character, and bitter the moral criticisms upon the writings of Lord Byron. His name has been considered synonymous with infidel impiety and fiend-like blasphemy. The anxious parent, while stamping the first idea of deity and excellence on the infant's mind, has taught him to fear this noble poet, as though he were the fallen archangel, and to detest his writings as a snare to virtue and as subversive of all good principles. His name has been a chiding byword with the waking mother, by which to still the cry of the innocent and unknowing babe. Thus a deep, unfounded, and lasting prejudice is planted in the puerile mind, and thus the germ of a causeless hatred toward an object unknown sends forth its poisonous tendrils in the youthful breast. To clear away this hatred and prejudice, or at least to lop the branches if the root should be immovably fixed, I will take up the most important of his works in succession and attempt to discover what grounds there may be for the popular charges of blasphemy and impiety. But ere we proceed, let us define the sin of blasphemy. The best authority calls it, quote, an indignity offered to God. Impiety, of course, is included in this, and if the charge of blasphemy can be done away, there is no other kind of impiety in his works so important as to demand present notice. In Childe Harold, we find the author evidently dejected by melancholy and almost driven, and was there not cause, to maddening misanthropy. But the blaming of man is far removed from insult to God. Nowhere in this poem is he found to imprecate the deity or to arraign his actions and their apparent principles. And it is, I believe, a remarkable truth that neither in this work nor in any other does he mention the name of Jehovah, but with reverence. unless indeed it be necessary to place words of impious nature in the mouth of some character, that it may appear true to life. Thus, if he were describing a ruffian or idolater, he must describe him with such sentiments as a well-judging reader or a just imagining writer would conceive requisite to fill out the character. But yet no one has the least right to consider these as the true sentiments of the author. For the Savior paints the feelings and expressions of the prodigal son in their true light, and as he must have felt and spoken. Yet the deist himself does not seize that as an argument against the piety of Christ. We allow that this poem expresses many sentiments and feelings injurious to social happiness and universal benevolence. But it should be remembered that they spring from a mind haunted with the remembrance of departed joy and days of bliss never again to be known. They are the language of a heart bursting with many real cutting miseries and chilled by the ingratitude of those who were nearest and dearest. Would you ask the mourner to sing you the song of joy, or the man of sorrows to paint the happiness he cannot feel? We come next to Don Juan. The scrupulously virtuous have said less concerning the blasphemy of this work than of its lascivious tendency. We will say nothing to this charge, as it would justly form the basis of another essay, and our present object is to do away in some degree the imputation of blasphemy. In answer to this charge, it can be with truth replied that the poem contains not a sentence of irreverence or indignity to the deity. Neither, we think, can the deceitfully jovial sentiments of this poem with so much propriety be held as the same feelings of a happy, life-enjoying man as the reaction of that excess of misery which had given rise to the harsh thoughts and troubled soliloquies of Childe Harold. The, quote, vision of judgment has, quote, without a hearing, been condemned by mankind at large and esteemed almost too gross for criticism. This was apparently written for the purpose of burlesquing that of Southey's, which is more impious, for it is serious, and more injurious, for it is decked in the, quote, wolf's clothing of fawning hypocrisy. In this poem, Lord Byron does not once mention the name of Jehovah or introduce him under any form. The chief characters are St. Peter, King George, and the angels, the former raised by Catholic superstition to be keeper of heaven's gates, than which idea nothing can be more absurd and ridiculous, is justly described as filling his high station with but an ill grace. For with what propriety can the spirit of anyone who has been mortal be placed by the whim of fanatics or cunning of creed-makers at the portal of heaven? The second person above mentioned is the hero of the story, and is treated with all due respect. Burlesquing angels, at first sight, we grant appeared more like blasphemy than anything we have yet met with in his works. But before we condemn this deed, let us see if it cannot be in some measure exculpated. The learned Dr. Beatty says, "Let the ridicule of wit be pointed at the follies, and let the scourge of satire be brandished at the crimes of mankind. All this is both pardonable and praiseworthy, because it may be done with good intention and produce good effects." Or, in other words, every man is justifiable in attacking by argument or ridicule what he esteems a whimsical conceit or foolish hypothesis. Now, if Byron believed, and there is great reason to think he did, that such things as angels were never existent except in the deluded imaginations of man, he surely cannot be deemed impious in expressing his opinion. Or can he be blamed for expressing his doubts of that fancy-built theory which makes spirits but little above man, the ministering servants of that God who is omniscient and omnipresent? If then Byron thought thus, why should he be accused of blasphemy in speaking his sentiments in such a manner as he thought would most firmly establish them on the downfall of what he esteemed a false hypothesis? Time and space forbid us to examine at present his other works. These three are the most important, which have been virulently attacked and condemned by the few comparatively who have read them, and the multitude have joined in the denouncing cry. I have not written this with the hope of persuading anyone, but shall feel well rewarded if by my means a few should be induced to inquire and form an opinion for themselves. Philus Poetria. Now, I've looked that up, Philus Poetria. I believe it's Greek, and I believe it means a philosopher poet, but I also gather that it's the feminine. Well, if it is, Matthew at age 13 just wasn't enough of a scholar to know that that was the feminine form of it. Possibly Abby had used that herself, and he just picked it up from her, not realizing that she had used the feminine form. At any rate, by the way, you notice the long discussion and defense of the proper use of satire. Matthew was a satirist, and there's quite a bit of evidence based on all the quotes and references he's made that he studied the satirists of Europe in great depth, very seriously studied them, and knew them backwards and forwards. So this is another indication that this is Matthew Franklin Whittier and not one of the other young men that are mentioned by Joseph T. Buckingham. So you get a sense of the mind of this 13-year-old boy. You know, this is not, as my detractor suggested, a, quote, bored former clerk in the struggling community of Roanoke. This is someone who is far more qualified than Charles Dickens to have written A Christmas Carol. Never mind reputation. You see what Matthew thinks about reputation here, and the masses, the opinion of the masses. What he's discussing as regards the negative opinion of Lord Byron is precisely the same dynamic which applies in the positive opinion of Charles Dickens. It's the same thing operating, except in the case of Lord Byron, the public had a negative impression of him, not having really read, these pieces. And in the other example, they have an unjustified positive impression of Charles Dickens, which is now being torn down rapidly by historians. And this is the crisis that's pending right now, is that academia already knows that Charles Dickens was a scoundrel who was cruel to his wife, okay, and a liar because he tried to get her thrown into an insane asylum on a false basis. He was actually having the affair, and whenever she would become suspicious, he would accuse her of being crazy to the point that he practically drove her crazy. And then when he had half driven her half crazy, he tried to have her put in an insane asylum. So this is the kind of scoundrel that is emerging now among the historians, among the scholars in academia. It hasn't really made it out into the public yet. Because if you look on YouTube where people are watching A Christmas Carol and they make their comments underneath, basically this information has not gotten to them yet, but it will. See, it'll filter out. And when it filters out, you'll have people that love Charles Dickens because they love A Christmas Carol because they've been deeply touched by it. And he's an asshole. So what do? There's only two things to do with that. One is to be just confused. And the other is to think, to actually lose hold of morality itself and spirituality itself and say, well, I guess the materialists were right. It's all just from the brain. It's all just brain chemistry. There is no intrinsic morality. It's all relative. The medium is the message, after all. It's just how you say it. And any asshole could have written A Christmas Carol if he was talented enough, see? And so a deep blow will be struck in the heart of people against intrinsic morality if they continue to believe that Charles Dickens, the asshole, had originated A Christmas Carol. This is the moral crisis that's coming as a result of this thing. The answer to the thing is very interesting because the real authors were esoteric Christians who had studied the paranormal and believed in it. See, and Abby, I think, was psychic, so she had personal experience of it. And Matthew had had personal experience of contacts with Abby across the Great Divide in the astral realm after she passed. So these were Christians, deeply committed Christians, but they were heretics according to traditional Christianity. So the traditional Christians who love A Christmas Carol and who believe that, you know, some people have actually written that Charles Dickens invented Christmas, you know, those people are going to be faced with a real conundrum, because either they believe that a scoundrel, a hypocrite, a flaming hypocrite, wrote A Christmas Carol who was not really religious, or they believe that heretics wrote it. See, they've got a real problem here. So clearly I'm persona non grata, and this little mention that was put beneath my post is just the tip of the iceberg of what's coming from me, you know. And they say that there's 3 stages to introducing a brand new paradigm-shaking idea. The first is to be ignored. The second is to be ridiculed, and that goes on a long time. And then finally, there's applause, see, probably after I'm gone. So I'm just barely pooching into the ridicule stage, the second stage. I expect quite a bit more. But here's the truth. What I want is to stir up controversy. I want the controversy. I want a controversy that brings the truth of reincarnation front and center into academia, including areas of academia that haven't dealt with these things, like the literary side, and the public. And I want that debate to go on for quite a while and quite vigorously. See, I don't expect to convince anybody. Like what Matthew says, it's the same higher mind. So Matthew says, I don't expect to convince anybody. I just want them to rethink it. Well, I'm saying exactly the same thing. And this is the parallels here. It's the same higher mind talking to you now as talked to you in the piece that I just read a minute ago. And I have the same conviction that I just want people to rethink it. You know, I don't expect to convince people. And in my case, I want the controversy. So I succeeded to the point that I had someone calling my findings ridiculous. That's a start. Now we're going to move on. I know this is going to be long. I could just end it here. We're at 39 minutes, but I'm going to go ahead because 2 examples is always better than 1. That's what Abby has told me or indicated to me, because we communicate kind of intuitively. So I don't get words. I get what I call thought bursts, or intuitive bursts that are like a whole paragraph worth of meaning, and then I can put them into words if I want to. And sometimes I'm right, sometimes I'm not right. There's no question she's doing it. The question is, can I interpret it? So here, and I don't have a copy of this physically, but I can put up a photograph of it on the screen while I read. What I have is my printout. This is from the December 9th, 1825 edition, the previous edition. And it's a poem, and it's about the nose. Now, Matthew, this definitely identifies it, I would say, as Matthew's work, because he had a long nose, and he was embarrassed about it all his life. He made fun of it all his life. He wrote about noses quite a bit. I could bring up quite a few examples. One notable one is in Yankee Doodle, 1847, I think it was. Matthew was writing for that publication. He did a whole series about nose and the nose, which he used as a way to talk about intuition and people that had spiritual perception and people who didn't. That people who had spiritual perception had nose, you know, and the ones that didn't were without nose, and so on. I've talked about that in my talk to the Jungian Society. So I'm going to read this straight on through unless I see something that I absolutely have to point out. This poem, written for the New England Galaxy, which means it's original, is entitled, "To the Right Honorable, Right Useful, Much Abused Member of All Societies, the Nose. Thou glorious feature, prince of all the rest, nose, nostril, snout, which e'er may please thee best. Thy sufferings and thy virtues I revere. To me, indeed, thou art infinitely dear. Think then how much it grieves me to behold some wretch expose thee to the winter's cold, shivering and blue, dismayed and tempest-tossed, pelted by rain and hail, or nipped by frost. Or see thee glowing in the sun's fierce rays, bright as a salamander in a blaze, a prodigy throughout the tropics shine, a meteor or a bonfire at the line. Afflicted, cudgeled, I have seen thee fall, for thou art always foremost at a brawl, pressed by some clodpole far into the mud, and drinking deeply of the sombre flood. Greatly thou rose again, and full of ire, emitted clouds of smoke, of blood and mire. But how can words such fearful scenes convey, or paint the horrors of that dreadful day? The huge backstrokes that did thy peak o'erwhelm, and laid thee flat upon thy little realm. Yet these are squibs compared to the deep pain which, in thy latter days, thou must sustain. Of snuff must take, murderous doses, exquisite sufferer, delicate proboscis, perhaps be pulled by some irreverent boy, or mill may thy sublimity destroy. Amazed at thy misfortunes, I confess, they are too much for a poor ounce of flesh. But courage, let us rather comfort find in the proud task of leading all mankind. Nor man's imperial race alone, but they that skim the liquid air or cut the sea. Thy Proteus form all animals obey, and promptly follow when thou leads the way. So history says, but I accept because the crabs are rebel to thy sovereign laws. Thou never couldst, by gentle means or force, compel his squinting legs to keep thy course. His brother imp, the cancer, 'tis well known, has made thee tremble, and desert thy throne. A stubborn horse, too, sometimes takes a whim, spite of thy teeth, to make thee follow him. With adverse step I've seen him backward run, and tread like me the path he ought to shun. Numpo. Well, there's some indicators that point to Matthew. I think that his nose was probably broken in a fight. That's my guess at some point, and that's what he's referring to here. But this just showcases Matthew's ability, again, at age 13, as a humorous poet. Now remember, his brother, John Greenleaf Whittier, was one of the premier poets of the United States and of that era. And Matthew would have had essentially the same education, plus John Greenleaf being 5 years older, he could have been instructed to some extent on poetry by his brother. So he comes by it honestly, aside from being extremely bright in himself, there's every expectation that Matthew would know his poetry. And one of the Trismegistus pieces is specifically a critique of popular poetry. So this is precisely what we would expect from Matthew, who deeply studied the satirists of Europe and the satirical poets of Europe, and who at age 13, who knows how long he may have been studying since age 8, for all we know. So, he has years of study under his belt in order to write this at age 13. Now, I want to mention that there were other people I've run across of that era who were also child prodigies. One of them in particular, who I think Matthew particularly disliked and who appears to have plagiarized 2 of Matthew's poems, Edward Everett Hale, was attending Harvard at age 13. Matthew very much wanted to go to school. He was prevented by finances and by his father. He couldn't get his father's permission. And Abby stepped in apparently and tutored him after he ran away from home, mostly, I think, probably by correspondence or visits and things like that. So Matthew got his education, and it's clear throughout his work because there's so many references. He knows his literature. Unlike me, I have studied hardly anything. I've studied the works of 3 God-realized masters. That was my decision because they're not toxic. You don't get their ignorance along with their wisdom. When you study the genuine spiritual masters, you only get their wisdom. See, so because I think Matthew got mentally toxic from having studied too many sources, and he was aware of the danger of that, actually, because he wrote about that. But in my youth, I was like toxic. I was confused. If I looked at something, well, I'll give you an example. This is very personal, but I went through a period of being very confused, and trying to generate my own philosophy. like at age 15, I was trying to create the theory of everything, psychological theory, and just got tied up in knots, Um, and it's kind of interesting. I remember that when I was 14, I got very freaked out by a particular philosophical problem. And that was, if you take an object and you cut it in half, and then you cut that half in half, and you keep cutting in half infinitely, would you reach zero? Well, it's a problem because it presupposes that you always have something to cut in half. And yet you said it goes on infinitely. So you could never reach zero. And yet, if you go infinitely, you have to reach zero. So I was tied up in knots with that as a kid of like 14. But I found that Matthew did a review of a talk in which that exact problem came up. And he kind of makes light of it, but I'll bet you it bothered him. So I carried that through apparently from that past life, that very problem. See, this is what I'm saying. The higher mind remains the same, even to specific concepts. So this is Matthew Franklin Whittier as a young satirist. And I think you'll agree, it's quite sophisticated for a 13-year-old boy. And the defense of Lord Byron, probably initiated by a discussion about it with his brother, was also Matthew Franklin Whittier, writing under some of the many different signatures that the editor, Joseph T. Buckingham, says he used when he called him Moses Whitney instead of Matthew Whittier. So there we have it. Remember that this is not only at age 13, but it's many years before Charles Dickens would publish anything. And when Charles Dickens did start publishing, it was pretty frothy stuff. There was nothing deep about it that I can see. The Dinner at Poplar Walk is a very shallow, fun, somewhat mean piece of literature. I don't see anything philosophical in it. The first time that we see anything moral, philosophical, or philanthropic, or of social conscience in Dickens literature is when he wrote the Pickwick Papers, if I'm not mistaken. And that was Robert Seymour, because Robert Seymour created the illustrations, and then Dickens kind of tied together or illustrated with words those illustrations. So he went off from what Robert Seymour had illustrated, which means that if there's anything spiritual or of social conscience in there, that was Robert Seymour. And if I read the history correctly, Robert Seymour tried to get Dickens to admit this. Dickens refused. They apparently had an argument about it, and the next day Seymour committed suicide, and Dickens never expressed any remorse or took any responsibility. That's the way I read in between the lines, reading the history. I could be wrong, but it sets a pattern, I mean, if you look at the violated letter and you realize that he was a flaming hypocrite and that we can prove it. And when I say flaming, I mean read the wording of the violated letter, because he doesn't just deny the affair. He goes on my soul, on my honor. And, he goes on with this exaggerated language, which is like, he's selling his whole soul to the devil in that language. Either you believe him 100%, or if you don't believe him, he's really a moral mess, one or the other. And this is the problem that people have, because if this thing turns, it turns 180 degrees. It's a total paradigm buster. In other words, it's frightening, because he not only, and Edgar Allan Poe is the same way, because Edgar Allan Poe, if you really see who he was, he turns out to be a phony, a literary imposter who couldn't write his way out of a paper bag, at least as a poet, but who managed to snow everybody. And this is beyond frightening for people who have invested in him. And when I say invested, I mean they've invested their careers. They've invested, everything in this. So it's pretty scary stuff. I don't have any choice but to challenge these things, and I expect a lot of blowback. So we shall see.